And now I would like to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Mr. Roy Miller. Roy is a Marshall native and left but then came back. He had such an affinity for the community, he decided to come back and graduate from Marshall High School in 1965. He's a graduate of Texas A&M University in Texarkana, where he had a Bachelor of Arts degree in Aviation Management and Technology. He presently serves as the Director of the East Texas Regional Airport in Gregg County. Prior to that time, from 1989 to 2011, it's about 22 years, wasn't it? Yeah. He served as the Executive Director of the Shreveport Airport Authority, where he did a remarkable job administering a $15 million annual operating budget and a $10 million capital budget there in Shreveport. Roy served his country in Vietnam. He was a helicopter pilot and received, in recognition for his acts of bravery, the Bronze Star, Air Medal 25 awards, the Army Commendation Medal, Vietnam Campaign Medal with 4 bronze campaign stars, Vietnam Service Medal, the National Defense Service Medal, the Presidential Unit Citation, and Vietnam Cross of Gallantry with the palm device. If you knew Roy in high school, you would wonder how he also received in that list of medals the Good Conduct Medal. But you know, military service will make a man out of it. So, without further ado, please honor and join me in welcoming our guest, Mr. Roy Miller. Captain.
Well, good morning and welcome again. I can remember being a little bit nervous occasionally when we knew we were going to make an insertion of what we called a hot LZ, but it's nothing like the butterflies this morning, so I'm honored to be here. I want to recognize my wife, Glenda. Judge Anderson married us and said that it's the only wedding he had performed after some 40-year courtship, so I like to tell that story. And I also want to recognize all the other veteran spouses and Glenda for putting up with us. It's not always easy to put up with a veteran. We tend to keep a lot of things to ourselves. With that, it's an honor and a pleasure to be asked to speak on this very important day, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. What a day that must have been. I saw Will Avery back here somewhere, who I call Bill Barton. I remember when we were going to school at Stephen F. Austin, and one day I said, well, Billy, I'm quitting school. I'm joining Army. He says, what in the hell are you doing? So here I am, Will Avery. Over the years, I've had many thoughts about what a veteran is, and more appropriately, who a veteran is. You might think that who a veteran is a pretty easy question to answer. Most dictionaries would describe a veteran as a person who has served in the armed forces or an old soldier who has had long service. I think most of us could probably agree with that definition. An unknown author, however, put it this way. A veteran is someone who at one point in his or her life wrote a blank check made payable to the United States of America for an amount up to and including my life. A non-military definition says that it's someone who has a lot of experience in a particular activity, and as Richard said, I graduated in 65, so we've got a lot of experienced people here today, so we probably fall into that category as well. I can tell you a time that it meant something for me to be a veteran. I was a young captain, and I was out processing from the 2nd Armored Division at Fort Hood, Texas. And having served with 101st, we have this Screaming Eagle patch, and when you're in a unit in the Army, you wear that patch on your left sleeve. When you've served with combat with that unit, you wear it on your right sleeve. So I was out processing at Fort Hood, and I saw this Lincoln Town Car pull up. And I heard a voice say, "Hey, Screaming Eagle," which is what we kind of say to each other. And I looked back, and a fella got out of the driver's side, raised the trunk, got a wheelchair, went over to the passenger side, helped a man get in that wheelchair. And I can't tell the story real well. But he hollered at me, went up, and he said, "Young Captain, I see that you're wearing that Screaming Eagle on that right sleeve." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "So you served in combat with 101st? I said, "I did." He said, "Well, I jumped at Normandy. That's how I got in this wheelchair, and I want to shake your hand." That's what it means to be a veteran. Anyway, I expected some of us to come up with our own definitions. Today, I'll try to let you know what I think a veteran is. A veteran is a somewhat ordinary person that has done some extraordinary things. They probably thought they'd only done what anyone else would have done and don't think of themselves as particularly special. They did what they did, and they did it well. They're part of a unique brotherhood. They came home and they picked up their lives. Unless you see them at the American Legion or the VFW, or like today on Veterans Day, you might not even know who they are or that they did anything that might be deemed very special. I want to address some thoughts about how we need to not only recognize and honor our veterans, but also how we should assure that they are taken care of for their service and in many cases sacrifice. My early recollections of a veteran began with my grandfather, Sam H. Miller, here in Marshall. He served in the trenches of World War I. I remember seeing his doughboy uniform hanging in a storage building behind his house here in Marshall, and my aunt telling me that he never talked much about his service, but that she did hear him one time mention he had been exposed to mustard gas. He went on to be a commercial painter, finished his life here in Marshall, never mentioned in his service or that he thought that what he had done was any more than his duty and that anyone else would have done it. Then I remember being an Army kid and being stationed in Germany with my mom and dad. He was in the old brown shoe Army. I remember he came home one day extremely upset because the Army was going to black shoes and green uniforms. He loved his Ike jacket. I remember being around him and some of his buddies. They never talked much about the war. They just talked about the good times they had and felt they'd simply done their job. There were two times that I remember my father making any reference to his wartime service. Once was on a cold winter day when he took my mother and me to a remote forested location in Germany and pointed out to her where he had been on a similar day in 1944. The other time was when he asked me why I had volunteered to be a helicopter pilot and go to Vietnam. After serving in the 101st Airborne Division Screaming Eagles, I realized that in the first instance, my father had taken us to the woods of Bastogne and was telling my mother how he was with General Patton when they relieved the 101st, and they were famous there for their answer to the Germans' request to surrender when the commanding officer said nuts. He never mentioned again what he'd done in the war. I learned through family members later he enlisted 1 week after Pearl Harbor, lied about his age. He was 17, got his dad to sign him up as 18. Joined the service, went straight to Europe, was involved in the second siege of the Battle of London, where he was shooting down V-1 and V-2 rockets. Then he went on with General Patton's 3rd Army all the way to Berlin. The second time he talked to me about the war was when I went to Vietnam, when he told me, "Son, it's not going to be what you think it's going to be." He was right. Having served in the Army myself, I've experienced being a veteran firsthand. I too have never talked much about serving. It was what I had seen my grandfather and father and many others do, and naturally I assumed I would do the same. The common theme that all these veterans have in common is they did what they did it well, and they never thought that anything was extraordinary about it and anyone else would have done the same thing. In the last few years, much has been made about what veterans have done and continue to do. That's a good thing. I remember the 60s and 70s when the case was much different. I can remember we never wore our uniforms off post. Now military personnel wear them with pride everywhere. That's a good thing too. We should be proud, all be proud of our military service. The Vietnam era changed a lot of things. During that period, many of us had mixed emotions about what we were doing. In many cases, our parents or other family members had served in previous wars. We'd all seen the John Wayne movies and read the books about the pride of military service. Then in the mid-1960s, the world seemed to turn upside down, and those serving in the military, whether in Vietnam or other theaters, were maligned and shunned. Somehow, we all got caught up in the middle of what I call the lost generation. Like the song The Old Hippie says, we might not have known whether to hold on to the old or grab on to the new. We'd seen our parents and others be patriots, and we saw our contemporaries saying, don't go. What were we to do? We did what we thought we were supposed to do. I remember coming home from Vietnam in the middle of the night so we wouldn't be harassed by protesters at the airport. I didn't have to worry about that when I came back to Marshall. I remember Judge Glenn Huffman welcoming me home and telling me about being a tank commander in Italy in World War II. When you came home to hometown America, you were still welcomed, and a lot of people never got that. All the things that went on during that time had an effect on how veterans were perceived and how we looked at ourselves. Over time, things changed. The Vietnam Memorial was built. Veterans began to get involved in local, state, and national level events. And gradually, the warrior stopped being blamed for the war. Joe Galloway, the author of We Were Soldiers Once and Young, was interviewed after the movie of his book came out. He was asked about Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation. Paraphrasing, Mr. Galloway said that he had the highest respect for and shared Mr. Brokaw's opinion of the World War II veterans, but based on his experience, if Vietnam veterans were not the greatest generation, they were the greatest of their generation. I agree. I was privileged to serve with the best troops in the world. The motto of Army Aviation is above the best, and that's what we were there to do. And those guys were the best at the time and are still today. This year at Arlington National Cemetery, I had the privilege of attending the funeral of my Huey crew chief, Terry Hill. If it weren't for Terry and others like him, I wouldn't be standing here today. He saved my life at least once every day. Because of the Vietnam veterans' experience, today's military has the highest respect from the public. As one of my fellow veterans said, if today's soldiers don't have to go through what we went through, then it makes what we did worth it. That brings me to my second point. George Washington said, the willingness with which our young people are likely to serve in any war, no matter how justified, shall be directly proportional to how they perceive the veterans of earlier wars were treated and appreciated by their nation. Theodore Roosevelt went on to say, a man who is good enough to shed his blood for his country is good enough to be given a square deal afterwards. We need to assure that all veterans are taken care of. It has been said that if old men instead of young men fought wars, we wouldn't have any wars. A lot of us veterans are now those old men. If we're going to engage in armed conflict and expend the money and other assets to conduct those activities, we need to assure that the men and women that take up that banner are well taken care of during and after their service. We never want to lose sight of the seriousness of putting them in harm's way. We need to always address their physical and emotional needs when they return. In a time of continuing government budget cuts, every effort should be made to assure that if we're going to pay for a war, that we're going to pay to take care of the warriors. I've used the VA system. I'm always impressed by the veterans I see there. They're from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the first Gulf War, and now Iraq and Afghanistan. What I see more and more is that there are more and more young people as I go. We have an obligation to them. I've found the VA to be responsive, but we need to continue our efforts to make sure that it stays that way. The VA should continue to be fully funded and staffed with caring, competent, and empathetic people with a commitment to serving our veterans who have served us all. I know of countless examples of individuals and groups who are working to see that our veterans are taken care of. Locally, Christina Anderson and others are heading an effort to make transportation available to veterans' health facilities. Others are working on other endeavors. We can all do our part. I want to encourage you to get involved at any level. Summarizing, veterans have had a long and storied record of service to our country and its citizens. They have served in war, they've served in peace, and they continue to serve to this day. That service must never be forgotten. It should be valued now and hereafter. Every effort should be made to ensure that adequate veteran services are always provided and will continue to be provided in the future. Let's all do our part. In closing, I want to mention a friend of mine from Shreveport, Ron Chatelain. Ron is the most living, decorated veteran in Louisiana. He served multiple tours in Vietnam, receiving the Distinguished Cross, the Silver Star twice, and 4 Purple Hearts. Anytime Ron recognizes a veteran, he thanks them for their service and he welcomes them home. I want to challenge you to do the same. I do. Remember, keep the faith, lest we forget. Thanks for listening, and welcome home.